When people hear the name Charles Manson, they picture one face. But the murders that terrorized Los Angeles in the summer of 1969 weren't carried out by one man, they were carried out by a network of followers so devoted they were willing to kill on command. Today, we're breaking down every core member of the Manson family, what they did, and what happened to each of them. And it starts with the man who built it all, Charles Manson. Charles Manson is one of the most recognizable names in criminal history, and yet most people get the most basic fact about him completely wrong. He's called a serial killer constantly. He's not one. Not in the literal sense. The man was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder without personally stabbing or shooting a single victim at Cielo Drive. He didn't pull the trigger, he didn't hold the knife, he told other people to do it, and they did, which is, arguably worse. Born Charles Mills Maddox on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Manson's childhood was basically a speed run through every red flag in the psychology textbook. Absent father, unstable mother, bounced between relatives and reform schools, institutionalized repeatedly before he was old enough to drive. By the time he landed in California in the mid-1960s, he'd spent more than half his life behind bars. And somehow, that's where the story actually starts. Here's the thing. Manson arrived in San Francisco right as the Haight-Ashbury scene was exploding, and he slid into it like he'd been custom built for the moment. Charismatic ex-con with a guitar, a handful of borrowed philosophy, and zero shame about using LSD as a recruitment tool. By 1967, he'd assembled the Manson family, a commune built on sex, drugs, stolen cars, and an apocalyptic ideology he called Helter Skelter. The name came from a Beatles song. The concept was his own fever dream. Helter Skelter was Manson's prophecy that a massive race war was coming. Black Americans would rise up against whites, win, and then, because they supposedly couldn't govern themselves, they'd need the Manson family to emerge from desert hideouts and take over. That was the plan. Hide in a bottomless pit in Death Valley, wait for civilization to collapse, then walk out and rule what was left. I don't know what to tell you. But here's where the debate gets interesting. Some researchers argue Helter Skelter was Manson's genuine belief that he truly thought the Beatles were sending him coded messages through the White Album. Others think it was purely a control mechanism, a way to keep his followers terrified and obedient. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but either way, it worked. The Tate-LaBianca murders in August 1969 were designed to kickstart this war. The word pig written in blood at the crime scenes, the staged brutality, all of it meant to look like the work of black radicals. 7 people dead across 2 nights. Manson directed the operations, chose the targets, and sent his followers out to kill. The convictions rested entirely on leadership liability and conspiracy. He was the architect, never the executioner. And that's the paradox that makes Manson endlessly fascinating and endlessly misunderstood. He also had a failed music career, got close enough to the Beach Boys to record at their studio, and when Hollywood rejected him, that wounded ego fed directly into the violence that followed. Across the entire family, 9 counts of first-degree murder were formally convicted, though LAPD has suggested additional uncharged victims may exist. Manson died on November 19, 2017 at age 83, still in prison, still receiving fan mail. But Manson was just the mouth. The people who actually carried out the killings, who held the knives and chose where to stab, those are the ones we need to talk about. And the first one on that list is the man Manson trusted most to get his hands dirty. Charles Tex Watson. When people think of the Manson murders, they picture Charles Manson. Makes sense. His face is on every documentary thumbnail, every true crime blog header, every Halloween costume that makes you question someone's taste. But here's the thing. Manson didn't kill anyone at Cielo Drive. The guy who actually led the attacks, who issued the commands, who personally inflicted many of the fatal wounds across 2 consecutive nights of slaughter, was a former high school athlete from Texas named Charles Tex Watson, and that's what makes him so unsettling. Watson was born December 2nd, 1945 in Copeville, Texas, a tiny rural community where he grew up playing football, making decent grades, and doing absolutely nothing that would suggest he'd one day be convicted of murdering 7 people. He was, by every available account, aggressively normal. The kind of kid who gets a nice yearbook quote and a firm handshake from the principal at graduation. Then he moved to California. He drifted into Manson's orbit, ended up at Spawn Ranch, and within a relatively short window went from unremarkable small-town transplant to the family's most effective weapon. On the night of August 9, 1969, Watson entered 150 Cielo Drive alongside Susan Atkins and a Patricia Krenwinkel. Inside that house, they murdered Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, along with Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Stephen Parent. 5 people in a single night. The following evening, Watson was back at it, taking a central role in the murders of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. 7 victims total across 48 hours, and Watson wasn't just present for these killings. Testimony and physical evidence show he took charge at the crime scenes, directed the other killers, and personally carried out much of the violence himself. He wasn't following orders in real time. Manson wasn't standing over his shoulder. Watson was the operational leader on the ground, making decisions and swinging the blade. He was initially sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment after California invalidated all pre-1972 death sentences. In prison, Watson found Jesus, or says he did. He became a born-again Christian, started a prison ministry, wrote a memoir, and has spent decades presenting himself as a transformed man at parole hearings. The parole board has not been convinced, and honestly, there's a reason Watson gets less attention than Manson in the cultural conversation, even though he did more of the actual killing. Manson is the better character. He's weird, quotable, visually iconic. Watson is just a guy from Texas who became a mass murderer, which is, not ideal, but it's also exactly what makes his story so important. He's proof that you don't need to look like a monster to become one. But Watson didn't act alone on either of those nights. And the woman who stood beside him at Cielo Drive might have the most disturbing post-crime testimony of anyone in the family: Susan Atkins. Susan Atkins is the person most responsible for turning the Manson murders from a crime into a myth. And I don't mean that as a compliment. Born May 7, 1948, Atkins went by a rotating cast of nicknames within the family, including Sadie, Sadie Glutz, Sadie Mae Glutz, and Sexy Sadie, because apparently one alias wasn't enough. She had a rough adolescence, drifted into the California counterculture, and eventually found her way to Manson. Once she was in, she was all the way in. Here's the thing about Atkins. She wasn't connected to just one crime scene. She was present at the Gary Hinman murder before the infamous August Nights. She was at Cielo Drive alongside Tex Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel during the Tate murders. And she was convicted of first-degree murder for her role in the killings at both locations. This wasn't a one-night breakdown. This was a pattern of escalating violence across multiple crime scenes, making her one of the most active participants in the family's murder spree. But what really cemented Atkins in the public consciousness wasn't just what she did. It was what she said afterward. While in jail awaiting trial, Atkins reportedly bragged about stabbing Sharon Tate and tasting her blood. Whether every detail of those jailhouse statements was literally true is still debated. But it didn't matter. Those claims hit the press and crystallized a very specific kind of horror in the public imagination. Suddenly, this wasn't just a murder case, it was something ritualistic, something almost inhuman. Atkins handed the media exactly the nightmare they wanted to sell, and then decades later, she started walking it back. She revised parts of her account, denied certain details, reframed her role, which is, not ideal when your original version of events helped shape the entire prosecution's narrative. Her story shifted so many times that figuring out which version of Susan Atkins you're getting depends entirely on what year you're asking. She was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment after California threw out its death penalty. She died in prison on September 24, 2009, after becoming one of the longest-serving female prisoners in California history. Every single parole bid she ever filed was denied. The uncomfortable truth about Susan Atkins is that she shaped the mythology of these murders more than almost anyone, including Manson. Her words, whether they were confessions or performances, became the story. She's the reason people picture the Tate killings as something out of a horror movie rather than a crime scene. But if Atkins built the myth, the woman who was right there beside her doing the actual killing has a story that's just as disturbing. Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia Krenwinkel is the member of the Manson family that nobody talks about, and that's a problem, because she was arguably more involved than anyone except Tex Watson himself. Born December 3rd, 1947, Krenwinkel went by a small collection of aliases during her time with the family: Big Patty, Yellow, Marnie Reeves, Marianne Scott. But within the group, everyone just called her Katie. And Katie was there for everything, not one night of killing, both nights. August 9th at Cielo Drive, August 10th at the La Bianca residence. She is the only female member of the family who was present and actively participated in the murders on both evenings. Here's where it gets dark. At Cielo Drive, Krenwinkel is specifically tied to the death of Abigail Folger. Folger tried to run. She made it out of the house and across the property, desperately trying to escape. Krenwinkel chased her down and stabbed her repeatedly until she was dead. That's not someone standing in the background following orders. That's pursuit. That takes a decision you have to keep making with every single step. And yet, in the decades of media coverage that followed, Susan Atkins became the face of female violence in the Manson murders. Atkins got the headlines. Atkins got the mythology. Krenwinkel, who was physically present at both crime scenes and personally responsible for one of the most brutal individual deaths at Cielo Drive, somehow faded into the background. Which is, not ideal for historical accuracy. After her arrest, Krenwinkel was sentenced to death. That sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment when California invalidated its death penalty. And then, something strange happened. She became, by all institutional accounts, a model prisoner. Quiet, cooperative, remorseful. At a 1994 parole hearing, the board actually praised her outstanding prison record. Then, they denied her parole anyway. The reason? The especially cruel and callous nature of the offenses. And that's been the pattern ever since. Krenwinkel demonstrates growth, the board acknowledges it, and then the weight of August 1969 crushes any chance of release. Standard rehabilitation metrics simply do not apply when the words Manson family are attached to your file. As of the mid-2020s, she remains incarcerated, one of the longest-serving female inmates in California history. Decades of good behavior, decades of expressed remorse, and zero movement toward freedom. The woman who chased Abigail Folger across a lawn in 1969 has spent over 50 years sitting still in a cell, and the parole board keeps telling her it's not enough. But if Krenwinkel's story is defined by being overlooked despite being central to the worst nights, Bobby Beausoleil's story is defined by the murder that started it all before those nights even happened. Bobby Beausoleil. Before the world ever heard the name Sharon Tate, before Helter Skelter became the most infamous phrase in true crime history, the Manson family had already committed murder, and the guy holding the knife was Bobby Beausoleil. Born November 6, 1947, Beausoleil was a musician and countercultural drifter who ran in the same circles as Manson and his followers. He wasn't a full-time commune resident the way some of the others were, but he was deep enough in the orbit to do Manson's bidding when it mattered. And in late July 1969, it mattered. The target was Gary Hinman, a California musician and PhD candidate. Here's the thing about Hinman that makes this whole story worse. He had actually been friendly with Beausoleil and other family members. He'd shown them hospitality, opened his home, and the way they repaid him was by showing up at his place in Topanga Canyon to demand money and property. Beausoleil arrived with Susan Atkins and Mary Bruner. What followed was roughly 2 days of holding Hinman hostage, beating him, and trying to squeeze him for cash he apparently didn't have. At some point during the ordeal, Manson himself showed up with Bruce Davis. And this is where it escalates from robbery to something far uglier. Manson allegedly slashed Hinman across the face with a sword, nearly severing his ear, then he left, just walked out, and left Beausoleil to finish the job. On July 27, 1969, Beausoleil stabbed Gary Hinman to death, but the killing itself isn't even the most significant part of this story. It's what they did after. The killers staged the crime scene, writing political piggy on the wall in Hinman's blood, and leaving a paw print, also in blood, to frame the Black Panthers for the murder. Sound familiar? The word pig written in blood at a murder scene to suggest a politically motivated killing. This was the prototype. The exact same playbook would be used at Cielo Drive less than 2 weeks later, which means the Tate LaBianca murders weren't some spontaneous explosion of violence. They were a refinement of a method that had already been tested on Gary Hinman's wall. Beausoleil's downfall was almost comically straightforward. Police found him sleeping in Hinman's stolen Volkswagen bus. That's it. That's how they caught him. His prosecution actually came before anyone connected the family to the Tate LaBianca killings, making his arrest one of the first threads that, once pulled, started unraveling everything Manson had built. Originally sentenced to death, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and Gary Hinman, the guy who let these people into his home, who was just trying to get his PhD and play music, he became the forgotten first victim. Which is, not ideal, but if Beausoleil's case showed the family was capable of calculated murder, the next member proved they were willing to do even dirtier work to protect their own. Steve Clem Grogan. Charles Manson once described Steve Grogan as too stupid to kill. And honestly, that might be the single worst character assessment in criminal history because Grogan went on to be convicted of murder. So either Manson was a terrible judge of intelligence, or his definition of stupid was wildly different from everyone else's. Both options are equally plausible. Born July 13, 1951, Grogan was one of the youngest members of the family, and he's consistently described as being less intellectually sophisticated than his peers. Which, when your peers include people who believed a Beatles album was a prophetic roadmap to a race war, is really saying something. But despite being treated as a kind of mascot by the group, Grogan was deeply embedded in family life at Spawn Ranch. He wasn't some drifter hanging around the edges, he was in it. His primary crime was the murder of Donald Shorty Shea, a stuntman who worked at Spawn Ranch and had the extremely unfortunate quality of being perceived as a threat to the family's continued presence there. Shea was believed to be cooperating with authorities, which basically painted a target on his back. In late August 1969, Grogan, alongside Manson and Bruce Davis, killed him. Shea's body disappeared entirely. For 8 years, nobody could find it. Then, in 1977, Grogan did something none of the other convicted Manson killers ever did. He told police where Shea's remains were buried. Here's the thing, that single act of cooperation fundamentally changed his legal trajectory. His death sentence was modified, and in 1985, Steve Grogan walked out of prison a free man. He and Leslie Van Houten are the only two people convicted of murder in the Manson killings who have ever been released. 2. Out of everyone, the guy Manson called too stupid to kill became a convicted killer, and then became the only one smart enough to cooperate his way out of a life sentence. I don't know what to tell you. Fan communities sometimes treat Grogan as a punchline because of his reputation for being dim, and he's been depicted in pop culture accordingly, portrayed by James Landry Heber in Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But treating him as comic relief trivializes what actually happened. He participated in the murder of a man whose only real crime was being inconvenient. Shorty Shea was killed because he threatened the family's ability to keep squatting on someone else's property. That's the reason. That's the whole thing. But if Grogan represents the dark irony of the family's lesser-known crimes, the woman who started it all represents something even stranger. Because without her, there might not have been a family at all. Mary Bruner. Without Mary Bruner, there is no Manson family, full stop. Every single thing we've talked about in this video traces back to one decision she made in 1967, and it changed American criminal history forever. Bruner was born in 1943 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and by all accounts she was living a perfectly normal life. She worked as a library assistant at UC Berkeley, she had an apartment, a job, zero criminal record. Then she met Charles Manson, fresh off his parole, and for reasons psychologists have been trying to untangle for over 50 years, she let him move in. That's it. That's the origin story. A library worker opens her door to a charismatic ex-convict, and the entire Manson family grows from that single apartment. Bruner didn't just become his first follower, she actively helped recruit other young women, essentially building the cult's foundation from the ground up. She was the proof of concept. If Manson could convince a working professional with a stable life to abandon everything for him, he could convince anyone. But here's where it gets dark. Bruner wasn't some passive early recruit who faded into the background. She was present during the Gary Hinman murder alongside Bobby Beausoleil and Susan Atkins. She helped hold Hinman hostage for 2 days, participated in beating him, assisted in cleaning up the crime scene, and admitted to hotwiring his Volkswagen bus so the group could steal it. This wasn't a bystander, and then she walked away from it, legally anyway. Bruner received an immunity deal in exchange for testimony against the others. She testified, helped the prosecution build its case, and then recanted parts of what she'd said. But the courts ruled the deal was permanent, and she could never be prosecuted for the Hinman murder, ever. Which is, not ideal if you're Gary Hinman's family. Now, you'd think getting away with involvement in a murder would be the wake-up call to get as far from Manson as humanly possible. Turns out, no. In 1971, Bruner participated in the Hawthorne gun store robbery alongside other Manson loyalists. The plan was to steal weapons, hijack a 747, and demand Manson's release from prison. The robbery ended in a massive shootout with police. Bruner was shot, arrested, and convicted. That Hawthorne robbery tells you everything about Mary Bruner. She was willing to rob a gun store, get into a firefight with cops, and attempt a plane hijacking for a man already behind bars. Her devotion didn't end when the murders happened. It didn't end when she got her immunity deal. It took a bullet and a prison sentence to finally pull her out of his orbit, and yet she remains one of the most overlooked figures in the entire Manson story. The woman who literally opened the door. But if Bruner was the first to fall under Manson's spell, the next person we need to talk about took that loyalty to an entirely different level, one that involved a sitting president of the United States. Lynette Squeaky Fromm. Here's someone that almost everyone gets wrong. If you ask the average person what Squeaky Fromm did, they'll tell you she was at the Tate LaBianca murders. She was part of the killing crew. She was right there with Tex and the others. She wasn't. Lynette Fromm was not directly involved in the Tate LaBianca murders, not at Cielo Drive, not at the LaBianca house, not on either night. She was a significant presence in the family, absolutely, and she remained one of the most intensely loyal members Manson ever had, but she wasn't there. The reason people assume otherwise is because of what she did next, which was somehow even crazier than the murders themselves. Let's start with the nickname. Squeaky reportedly came from George Spahn, the elderly owner of Spahn Ranch where the family was squatting. Spahn said she made a squeaking sound when he touched her, which is, not ideal on about 4 different levels, but the name stuck, and it followed her straight into the history books. After Manson was imprisoned, most of the family scattered or faded into obscurity, not Fromm. She became Manson's public spokesperson, his ideological ambassador to the outside world. While other members were distancing themselves or lawyering up, Squeaky was out there keeping the gospel of Charlie alive. She was essentially a one-woman PR department for a convicted cult leader. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. On September 5th, 1975, Lynette Fromm attempted to assassinate the President of the United States. She approached Gerald Ford at the California State Capitol in Sacramento and pointed a M1911 pistol directly at the sitting president. The weapon did not fire. She hadn't chambered a round. The gun had a loaded magazine but 0 bullets in the chamber, so she's standing there, pointing a .45 at the leader of the free world, and it just clicks. This detail has sparked decades of debate. Did she genuinely intend to kill Ford and simply made a critical mechanical error? Or was it theatrical, a spectacle designed to grab headlines? Her stated motive leans toward the latter. She said she did it to draw attention to environmental issues using the acronym ATWE, which stood for Air, Trees, Water, and Animals. That acronym came directly from Manson's own rhetoric, so even the assassination attempt was, in her mind, an extension of Charlie's philosophy. She was sentenced to life in prison and served approximately 34 years before being paroled in 2009. 34 years for pointing an unchambered gun at a president. That's longer than some people serve for actually killing someone. Fromm represents something most people don't consider when they hear the name Manson. The influence didn't end when the cell door closed. It mutated into radical environmentalism and eventually an assassination attempt on the most powerful person on the planet. The murders were the headline, but the ideology had a life of its own long after 1969. But if Fromm was the family's most loyal soldier after the fact, the next person we need to talk about is the one who burned it all down from the inside. Linda Kasabian. Linda Kasabian is the most morally complicated person in this entire story. Not the most evil, not the most dangerous, but the one who forces you to actually think about what justice means. Born June 23rd, 1949, Kasabian joined the Manson family in the summer of 1969. That timing matters. She wasn't a long-term devotee who'd been marinating in Manson's ideology for years. She showed up basically right before everything went completely sideways. On the night of August 9th, 1969, Kasabian drove Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel to 150 Cielo Drive. She parked. She waited. She stood outside while 5 people were murdered inside. The following night, she did it again for the La Bianca killings. Same job, driver, lookout, the person who made sure the killers got where they needed to go and had a ride home afterward. Here's the thing, she never stabbed anyone, never shot anyone, but she drove the car, she watched the door, and when it was all over, she didn't pick up a phone and call the police. Not that night, not the next morning, not the next week. That makes her an accomplice to mass murder. Full stop. But then something happened that changed everything. The prosecution needed a witness, someone who was there, who saw Manson's control firsthand, who could describe how orders flowed from Manson to Watson to the rest of them. Linda Kasabian was the only person willing to talk. She spent 18 days on the witness stand. 18 days. She described how Manson manipulated his followers, how the murders were organized, and exactly what happened on both nights. Her testimony was the single most important piece of evidence in convicting Charles Manson, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. In exchange, she received total legal immunity. No charges, no prison time, no record. A woman who drove killers to a crime scene and stood watch while pregnant, Sharon Tate was murdered, walked away completely free. You can argue this both ways. Without her testimony, Manson might never have been convicted. The prosecution's entire case relied on proving he ordered the murders without being physically present, and Kasabian was the one who connected those dots. But she also could have been convicted. Legal scholars have pointed out for decades that her actions were more than sufficient for a murder charge. She wasn't some random bystander, she was the getaway driver. Twice. Kasabian died on January 21st, 2023, having lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity under changed names. The immunity deal remains one of the most debated decisions in American legal history. Sometimes the justice system has to choose between punishing everyone involved and actually catching the person at the top. And when it makes that choice, somebody walks. Which is, not ideal, but if you think Kasabian's moral situation is complicated, wait until you hear about the family member who stabbed a woman, went to prison for over 50 years, and then actually got released. Leslie Van Houten. Leslie Van Houten is the ending to this story that nobody saw coming. She joined the Manson family in 1968, meaning her window of involvement before the murders was relatively brief compared to members like Atkins or Krenwinkel. But brief doesn't mean peripheral. On August 10, 1969, Van Houten participated in the La Bianca murders. She wasn't at the Tate house the night before. But at the La Bianca residence, she actively stabbed Rosemary LaBianca, including inflicting wounds after the woman was already dead. This is not someone who stood in the corner and watched. And then her legal saga became the most bizarre in the entire Manson case. Her initial conviction and death sentence were reversed because her attorney literally disappeared during the trial. Just vanished. The retrial ended with a deadlocked jury, meaning 12 people couldn't agree on a verdict for someone who stabbed a woman in her own home. A subsequent trial convicted her again, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. here's where it gets complicated. Over the following decades, state parole panels repeatedly recommended her for release, and every single time, the governor vetoed it 5 times. 5 separate governors looked at the recommendation and said, no, the name Manson carries that much weight. It doesn't matter what the parole board says, the word Manson is a life sentence all on its own. But in 2023, the courts overturned the 5th veto. And on July 11, 2023, after more than 52 years behind bars, Leslie Van Houten walked out of prison. Then, on August 7th, 2025, she was formally discharged from parole entirely. Her sentence is over. Completely. Done. As of 2025, she and Steve Clem Grogan are the only people convicted of murder in the Manson killings to have been released. Grogan got out in 1985 after helping police find Shorty Shay's body. Van Houten got out after half a century of what every review board called genuine documented rehabilitation, and that's the question her case leaves behind. Can 52 years of model behavior erase a night where you stabbed a woman who was already dead? Does redemption mean anything if the crime is famous enough? Both sides have a point. Neither side is fully right. A woman who was sentenced to die for a Manson murder is now completely free. Not on parole, not under supervision, free. That's either the justice system working exactly as intended or its most spectacular failure. And honestly, I don't know which one it is. I don't think anyone does. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.